When war with Julius Caesar seemed inevitable, the aristocratic clique of Cato quickly rallied around the accomplished general Gnaeus Pompeius to lead their armies. Known today as Pompey the Great, his career of remarkable battlefield exploits and conquests made him the natural choice for the traditionalist faction, who sought perhaps the only man who possessed the military acumen of Caesar to protect their conservative vision of the Republic. But though Pompey's resume as a commander was unimpeachable, his credentials as a Republican were far less sterling. For not only had Pompey been a longtime political ally of Caesar and supported the disruptive innovations of the great Populare, Pompey in his youth had demonstrated outright disdain for Republican convention, law, and precedent. Though known to posterity as Pompey the Great, he had an altogether different nickname at the start of his career, Adolescentialis Carnifex, or the Young Butcher, in reference to the bloody executions of political opponents that he oversaw as a lieutenant of the reactionary dictator Sulla. Despite no legal authority as a general or a magistrate, many prominent men were executed on his orders, including Brutus's father, and Carbo, a man who had been consul 3 times. It goes without saying that these foes were afforded none of the legal protections that they were entitled to as Roman citizens, with Pompey disregarding their rights in favor of brutal efficiency. An anecdote preserved by Plutarch is illustrative of his thinking at this time. Pompey treated them all with kindness except the Mamertines in Messana. These declined his tribunal and jurisdiction on the plea that they were forbidden by an ancient law of the Romans, at which Pompey said, "Stop quoting laws to men with swords." That such a man would be called upon a generation later as the savior of the Republic is a significant indictment of just how severely Republican norms, consensus, and legitimacy had dissolved. Perhaps desperate times called for desperate measures, or perhaps there were simply no Republicans left. If you believe, as I do, that neither side of the Civil War was particularly interested in restoring the idealized version of the Republic that was accountable to the people and saw power shared diffusely across a number of aristocratic clans, then it is natural to ask why this form of government had lost its appeal. While this debate could fill an entire library, it becomes easier to discuss these questions if we abandon a belief in monocausality for such a significant shift. A number of earlier videos have posited potential causes, and though historians can haggle over the primacy and relative influence of each, what cannot be doubted is that there was a significant interplay between factors that led to a steady erosion in Republican legitimacy across all levels of society. One of the initial cracks in the Republican facade accompanied the tumultuous tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus, and then that of his brother Gaius a decade later. But while the problems and political fault lines that the brothers exposed were significant, the delegitimization of the Republic occurred not with their reform agenda, or even their unprecedented political tactics, but with the brutal suppression of their movements. These bloody reactions revealed to the Roman people the true face of their governing class, and highlighted that Rome was, and indeed always had been, a society set up for the benefit of the few, to the exclusion of all others. While the death of Tiberius Gracchus, and 300 of his supporters, was a tragedy, the precedent of violence that this wave of extra-legal repression set would prove to be even more damaging to the Republic, as it illustrated the undeniable precarity of the system. There can be no doubt that whatever laws or conventions Tiberius Gracchus may have contravened in his political tactics or repeat tribunician candidacy, that the greater infraction lay with the lynch mob organized by Tiberius's cousin, the Pontifex Maximus Scipio Nasica, who had gone against the wishes of the Senate to violently purge the city of the Gracchian leadership. As the Republic inched toward another crisis point during the tribunate of Gaius Gracchus in 121 BCE, the elite realized that if they stuck to convention and precedent, then there would be no way of reversing populare legislative successes, and that the privileges which they regarded as their right would gradually erode. In order to defend their narrow conception of the Republic against the populist vision articulated by Gracchus and his supporters, the elite decided that the most time-honored traditions and customs must be jettisoned. It was decided that new powers were required to solve the problem of the intractable populists. To deal with Gracchus, the Senate passed the first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a phrase often translated into English as the final decree, instituting something akin to martial law. The motion gave carte blanche to the magistrates to destroy the Gracchus encampment, however they saw fit. It decreed that citizen rights to appeal and protection by their elected tribunes were to be suspended. It is critical to note here that the Senate had no legally defined power to pass laws, much less to erase constitutional protections at its own whim. But as Gracchus and his supporters soon discovered when they encountered aristocratic enforcers bearing arms within the sacred city limits, there was no use quoting law to men with swords. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. The use of this procedure to quell the Gracchus movement highlights the dissonance inherent in any analysis of Republican politics that presents the conservative aristocrats as principled defenders of Republican norms against power-hungry populares, intent on instituting tyrannical one-man rule. For, in circumventing the constitutional process to grant new powers to the Senate, the elite were not protecting any semblance of Republican government, save that which existed in their deluded fantasies. Too often, the Gracchus and other popular reformers are seen as the chief instigators of conflict, and the only force working against Republican institutions. Even when select historians are judicious enough to recognize the severe constitutional breaches of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, there is a tendency to write the decision off as a hasty and tragic overreaction, instead of a deliberate decision to strike out at rights which made up foundational aspects of the Republican system, and a key component of the popular legitimacy of the state. All too often to historians, these protections for the populace can be seen as negotiable, or somehow tangential to the makeup of the Republic, their abrogation not meriting as much scholarly hand-wringing as populare breaches of the laws and conventions which curbed the power and influence of their mass movements. We take our elite sources at face value when we perceive the aristocrats as the only true Republicans, or the faction that is inherently more central and worthy of protection by law. For, to the elite Roman, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum that resulted in the death of Gaius Gracchus and his supporters was not a regrettable error, but rather a new tool for keeping popular agitators in line. The revocation of constitutional protections would be deployed again in 100 to smash the populist movement of the radical tribune Saturninus, alongside countless supporters who were slain without trial. Cicero would also rely on the Senatus Consultum Ultimum to expedite the execution of the captured Catilinarian conspirators in 63. These pronouncements would be made with increasing regularity as the Republic entered a death spiral in its final decades, a reflection of the rapidly eroding popular legitimacy of the Republic and the growing disillusionment with a system plagued by seemingly unresolvable contradictions. It is my contention, then, that the introduction of legalized violence through the Senatus Consultum Ultimum was exponentially more destabilizing to the core fabric of the Republic than any novel political tactics or campaigning anomalies on the part of the Gracchus. The death of Tiberius should have been a one-off, the actions of an impetuous lynch mob acting against Senate orders. But within a decade, elite opinion had shifted dramatically to the point that they felt the repression practiced in the provinces was now a necessary tool for reining in domestic discontent. But to understand the true nature of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, we must again reflect on the proper role of the Senate within the Roman constitutional framework, as broadly understood at this time. In this era, the Senate had no authority to make laws. Instead, that power rested entirely with the popular assemblies, aka the people themselves. The Senate was limited to offering advice alone. Granted, because the body was composed of the leading citizens in a highly stratified society, the recommendations of the Senate were almost always honored. Consuls and other magistrates were of course under no compulsion to do this, however, but because the term in office was 1 year, while a senator served for life, each had a vested interest in elevating the standing of the Senate, as he would soon relinquish the magistracy and engage in politics again as a senator alone. The Senate's authority was thus based on convention, not law, and the social standing of its members is what gave its decrees authority instead of any actual legal process. In this light, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum can be more properly understood. For the decree was not a legal command to the consul, demanding that he defend the state, but rather a promise of protection for the consul against any future efforts to bring him to trial for the breach of constitutional order. It was not a law, but rather a blood pact, where the aristocracy demonstrated its shared class interests and promised to marshal its overwhelming resources in defense of the consuls in the future should the need arise. Thus, it can be read as a tacit admission of wrongdoing and an acknowledgement that legal penalties could arise naturally from the actions delineated in the decree. Such a promise of protection by the combined political and economic power of the Senate carried considerable weight, as it was impossible to achieve legally sanctioned justice outside of aristocratic-controlled channels. But, in spite of the long odds, there were consistent efforts to bring consuls to justice for actions taken under the auspices of a Senatus Consultum Ultimum. This helps illustrate that it was never a codified legal procedure, or an unimpeachable precedent. There was always bound to be dissatisfaction with the butchers who ran roughshod over popular rights, despite the self-serving insistence that these abuses were carried out in the name of public safety, or that the victims were enemies of the state. In fact, prosecutions of consuls for actions carried out under a Senatus Consultum Ultimum began with Lucius Opimius, the consul of 121 and the man tasked with the murder of Gaius Gracchus, Marcus Fulvius Flaccus, and their supporters. Though his acquittal likely came as no surprise considering his strong connections to the aristocracy and the solidarity they were incentivized to demonstrate in his defense, it did send a message that no man was above the law, and likely contributed to an erosion of support for Opimius as he was exiled later for alleged corruption on a separate charge. And yet this Opimius, who was the first consul to exercise the power of a dictator and put to death without trial besides 3,000 other citizens, Gaius Gracchus and Fulvius Flaccus, of whom one had been consul and had celebrated a triumph, while the other was the foremost man of his generation in virtue and reputation. This Opimius could not keep his hands from fraud, but when he was sent as ambassador to Jugurtha, the Numidian, was bribed by him, and, after being convicted most shamefully of corruption, he spent his old age in infamy, hated and abused by the people. Another consul who faced legal repercussions for actions taken under a Senatus Consultum Ultimum was Cicero, who had captured Catilinarian conspirators executed in 63. Despite the fact that the men were citizens entitled to legal proceedings and represented no immediate threat, Cicero received senatorial backing for their deaths, and both sides of this illuminating debate are even preserved by the historian Sallust. Though never brought to trial for these murders, Cicero's arch-rival Clodius would pass a unique law that criminalized any effort to execute a Roman citizen without trial. While this sounds innocent enough, a provision made the law retroactive, meaning that Cicero could then be prosecuted under a law which had not existed during his consulship. Reading the political winds and knowing that he would be condemned, Cicero went into voluntary exile to evade prosecution, though he would return a year later. But perhaps the most curious case of prosecution was an effort guided from behind the scenes by Julius Caesar in 63 against Caius Rabirius, a seemingly inconsequential Roman senator, for his involvement in the murder of the sacrosanct and inviolable tribune Saturninus roughly 4 decades earlier. Though Caesar's uncle Marius led the efforts to destroy Saturninus, we do not know if Rabirius was a key player in the Populare Purge, or merely one of the last senators from this age left alive to be held to account. Perhaps Caesar was even intentionally targeting a senatorial backbencher to demonstrate that there could still be accountability, decades later, no matter how small one's involvement in the deaths of Roman citizens had been, and that even if the elite would protect a consul, they may not show the same commitment to all who had been involved in the plot. Caesar, in concert with the tribune Titus Labienus, a man who would go on to be his greatest ally in Gaul and his greatest foe in the Civil War, brought high treason charges against Rabirius, in effect directly challenging the legitimacy of acting under a Senatus Consultum Ultimum. Though defended by Cicero, Rabirius was found guilty. However, the tribunal was dissolved through an arcane bit of legal chicanery before the decision was ratified by the people. Caesar decided not to press for Rabirius's death, as the clear goal of the trial had been to delegitimize the entire concept of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum and to encourage hesitation before the tactic was employed again against his populare allies. Caesar, it turns out, was right to understand that the trajectory of his own political career marked him out as a potential target of a future Senatus Consultum Ultimum, and wanted to defang this option. Ironically, though, he appears to have overplayed his hand, and he was the target of a Senatus Consultum Ultimum in 62 for his aggressive political tactics as praetor, when he tried to strengthen Pompey by giving him expanded military command. But the fact that Caesar backed down from his initiative and was quickly accepted back into the fold of republican politics may demonstrate that this particular decree was a bluff, or perhaps not as all-encompassing in its scope as previous declarations had been. Or possibly the threat of later prosecution by a future populare discouraged the consuls from seeking a violent confrontation. Caesar would not be so lucky in January of 49, when a second Senatus Consultum Ultimum was issued against him, this time, ironically enough, empowering Pompey to take efforts to protect the Republic against Caesar. Though Caesarian tribunes vetoed the measure, it was still carried, and it demonstrated that the rift between Caesar and the oligarchic faction was irreparable. War was now inevitable, and Caesar crossed the Rubicon shortly afterwards, starting a war with Pompey over the future of the Republic. It is from this final issuance of a Senatus Consultum Ultimum under what can still be called a republican form of government that we receive the name for this decree, as relayed by Caesar himself. For these reasons everything was done in a hasty and disorderly manner, and neither was time given to Caesar's relations to inform him of the state of affairs, nor liberty to the tribunes of the people to deprecate their own danger, nor even to retain the last privilege which Sulla had left them, the interposing their authority. But on the 7th day they were obliged to think of their own safety, which the most turbulent tribunes of the people were not accustomed to attend to, nor to fear being called to an account for their actions till the 8th month. Recourse is had to that extreme and final decree of the Senate, which was never resorted to even by daring proposers except when the city was in danger of being set on fire, or when the public safety was despaired of. That the consuls, praetors, tribunes of the people, and proconsuls in the city should take care that the state received no injury. This final republican instance of the final decree illustrates just how significantly the stakes had been raised since the tactic was first employed against Gaius Gracchus. The stark contradiction that was always at the heart of these efforts to simultaneously reinforce what the elite regarded as the republican legal tradition, while also fatally undermining rule of law, had worked itself out to its inevitable conclusion by damaging the popular legitimacy of the state. Rome was no longer a shared project of disparate peoples and social classes working in concert towards a common goal. The state was now a prize for one faction to seize and wield against opponents. A republican system is impossible in such a setting. In the words of Michael Parenti, "When change threatens to rule, the rules are changed." So, while the imposition of a state of emergency to quell the popular faction may have appeared like the best option to the opponents of Gracchus in 121, it would become clear only a few decades later that their decision to embrace violence and wipe away civic protections had struck a blow not just against the populares, but against the very ideological fiction of a balanced and participatory polity that they depended on to achieve mass consent. As the bodies of Gracchus and his supporters were tossed into the Tiber, their grisly deaths were a final testament to the coercive mechanisms employed by the ruling class to maintain dominance. Caesar knew the fate that awaited him if he returned to Rome without an army at his back. Can we then be surprised that he chose to cast the dice and cross the Rubicon? War was not beginning. It was entering its final act.